Well, if you look at the results of studies that have been done on sharks, as I mentioned before, the first ones were kind of slow, not the most active sharks. A few of them were cold water species, but they were able to record the amount of oxygen consumption and document changes in the amount of oxygen consumption over time to estimate metabolic rate in sharks that are held in captivity. They were also able to look at the effects of different environmental conditions, such as the swimming speed, the rate that the sharks were swimming, and temperature, things like that. So if we look at this figure here, this shows the amount of oxygen that's used per unit weight per hour for the lemon shark and the black-nose shark, the mako shark, leopard shark, scalloped hammerhead shark. These are some of the species that have been measured. And so one of the objectives of these studies was to look at these sharks and the level of activity that they experience in the wild. Sometimes they're swimming fast, sometimes they're not swimming that fast, sometimes they might even be laying on the bottom. So how does the metabolic rate vary with those levels of activity? So these were some of the first species that have been investigated in terms of looking at metabolic rate by measuring oxygen consumption. Well, this is usually done with respirometers. So you have some kind of chamber that's filled with water. You have an ability to measure the oxygen consumption. So you have an oxygen probe that tells you how much oxygen is in this water. You put the animal in there, you seal that chamber, you know how much oxygen you started with, and as time goes on, then oxygen is used and the oxygen content of the water declines over time. So all you have to do is measure the amount of oxygen as it's declining every 5 minutes or every minute or every 30 seconds. You're watching this oxygen decrease as the organism is using it. That's why the amount of oxygen is declining in the water, is because it's being used to synthesize ATP to support the metabolic demands of this animal. So if you've weighed this animal before you put it in there, so then it's very easy to calculate how much oxygen is used per unit weight per unit time. Just put the thing in the respirometer and follow the path of oxygen consumption over time. So here's the setup, and this this photo, shows a shark in one of these respirometers. Now this is a annual respirometer. It's got water that flows through this respirometer. So you can put a shark in there and seal the top. It's got oxygen probes, so you're measuring the amount of oxygen that's being used, and you know how much this shark weighs. The shark is under certain conditions. The water, there's little impellers that can move the water through here at a certain speed. So first you can start out just with the shark at rest and measure how much oxygen is being used. Then you can turn up the speed and the shark will get up off the bottom and start swimming. And it'll try and maintain its position here, so it's not hitting against the front, it's not hitting against the back, but it's just swimming in place like it normally would out in the wild. You can also measure the temperature of the water. You could feed the shark. You could have it under different conditions where you're measuring the metabolic rate. There's only certain species that will lend themselves to being held in captivity like this. There are some of them that just wouldn't cooperate or that wouldn't do well. And then all they would be doing is measuring stress as this animal thrashes around. But there's some species that worked very well. Put them in here and then have the water go faster and faster until the shark can't swim anymore, and then it's pushed up against the back. So you can get a basal or standard metabolic rate for the most part, because you can't get these just to rest. And you can get the metabolic scope of these animals. Now this is a highly artificial condition, obviously, with this shark in a respirometer, and it's not anything like a natural setting other than that it's a shark and that it's swimming. So there's been attempts to measure metabolic rate in the wild using different measurements. So one thing that's been done, they put tail beat transmitters to be able to see how fast the tail beat was beating, how fast the tail was moving back and forth, which is going to influence how fast they're swimming. So if you can get an idea of how much oxygen they're using at different swimming speeds, and you can use tail beat frequency to measure swim speed, then if you can put a transmitter on a wild shark while it's out there swimming around, you can tell how fast it's swimming, which gives you an idea of how much oxygen is being used in a wild sharks, not in one that's in this artificial setting. There's been other attempts with heart rate, where heart rate increases with the level of activity, and if you can measure the heart rate, you can get a good idea of what the metabolic rate is. And the idea is that you can calculate, you can estimate the amount of energy that's being used by an individual animal out in the wild. Which gives you a lot of information about the role of that organism in its ecosystem, how much energy is flowing through it, what the energy demands are, how the energy changes over the life of the animal or throughout the day, different seasons, conditions like that in the wild. It's quite a thing to be able to accomplish, but that's what everybody's trying to do. So here's some metabolic rate measurements for different species. And again, you try and put these in, if it's an obligate swimmer, then you can't get them to rest. But you try and measure either the basal metabolic rate or the standard metabolic rate. This is the standard metabolic rate. So this is at a low level of activity for these different species. And then you put them in and try and make them swim faster and faster. And so here's the oxygen consumption. This is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per hour is what these units are. And here's different species, and you see a lot of them are 50 or 100. There's a few that are higher. There's the black-nosed shark, and there's the mako shark. A mako shark, is very active, high performance, so it's one you would expect. This is mako shark that's just not swimming that fast. And these yellow ones are skates and rays. So the typical shark, if there is such a thing, and a ray, have relatively low metabolic rates. If you're expressing metabolic rate as milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per hour, you've got a few species that have pretty high metabolic rate. Now, if you took bony fish, you'd see a lot of them in the same range, but these active bony fish like tuna or billfish, then their metabolic rate would probably be up here. And if you increase the swimming speed, then this mako shark rate of metabolic, or its metabolic rate of oxygen consumption would probably shoot off of the scale here, where these other ones, they're not going to go that high because they can't swim that fast. There's a number of factors that influence metabolic rate. How much ATP do you need? Of course, it varies with swimming speed, as we looked at in that other figure. But another thing that affects metabolic rate is temperature. Warmer temperatures, things are happening faster. Enzymes are carrying out reactions more quickly, and metabolic rate increases with temperature. So here's two different species of shark. This yellow is a colder water, slower swimming shark, and this blue one is a faster swimming shark that you find in a lot warmer water. But you can see in both of these species what happens if you increase the temperature. Here's the temperature from 10 degrees to 15 degrees to 20 degrees. For both species, the metabolic rate is higher. It starts out here down, maybe it's only 20 or 30, but at 15 degrees, it's all the way up to 100 or so. And then this one, if you go up to 25 degrees, then look how high the metabolic rate is. And this one that tolerates these warmer waters, it's all the way up over 200 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per hour, which is, again, what these units are. So swim speed, activity, obviously, influences metabolic rate. Temperature, obviously, influences metabolic rate. Salinity and the costs associated with osmoregulation have a big influence on metabolic rate. The more you have to expend on metabolism, then the more expensive it is. The more energy you use, the more oxygen you use. Dissolved oxygen depends on how easy it is to extract oxygen out of the water. Sometimes it gets to be quite a struggle and you're expending a lot of energy trying to do that. Time of day has to do with level of activity. If you're active at night or during the day, it's going to fluctuate. Feeding state. If you eat something, then your metabolic rate goes up. You're expending energy to move that food through your digestive system to produce those enzymes to digest the food. So right after you eat, your metabolic rate goes up and then eventually declines back down to this standard metabolic rate where you're not expending energy to process food. Well, how does the metabolism mesh up with respiration? Well, obviously, if you're going to supply a certain amount of energy, ATP is going to be synthesized, you need a certain amount of oxygen. And in sharks and skates and rays and many other aquatic organisms, the respiratory surface, this big surface where there's a lot of blood that's a very short distance from a lot of water, of course that structure is gills. So we've seen that the animals swim along, they open their mouth, water flows across their gills. As water's flowing across their gill, then oxygen is being delivered. So the ability to have water move across your gills is going to be very indicative of how much oxygen you're going to be able to extract. And of course, if you're laying on the bottom like this nurse shark versus swimming along quickly like this porbeagle shark, then you're going to have different levels of activity. You're going to have different amounts of ATP that are needed, but you're also going to be moving different amounts of water across your gills if you're laying on the bottom and opening and closing your mouth to pump water versus swimming with your mouth open. So what you see is something like a nurse shark, it could open its mouth and swim along and just have water move through its gills, but they spend a lot of time on the bottom. Skates and rays spend a lot of time on the bottom. By opening and closing their mouth, they can suck water in, pump that water out, not out their mouth, but out through their gills. And by pumping, they're pumping water across their gills and providing oxygen for their metabolic demands. These sharks they're obligate swimmers. They're not going to open and close their mouth to pump water across their gills. They're just going to open their mouth and swim. They ram ventilate as opposed to pumping. And by ram ventilating, well, first of all, they're constantly swimming. And second of all, just by opening your mouth and having water flow into your mouth, out your gills, then you're aerating your gills very effectively. Okay, so for the next snippet, the next part of this video lecture, I have to put these in small amounts of time to be able to get them to upload onto YouTube. Then we'll move into respiratory structures, which again are mostly going to be the gills, and then the idea of the flow of blood versus the flow of water in this countercurrent circulation.